If you have a Bible and find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Joshua chapter 1. This is where we're going to spend our time today. Just as in the hymn we just sang, we say, "We will follow." And how easily we say that, and yet that doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. One of the aspects of God's image, we say we're made in God's image, which is true biblically. Male and female, in His image He made us. But what does that even mean? God, if I take the Bible seriously, has no image whatsoever. He's imageless. He's a spirit. And the Jews were so careful that in no place, in any synagogue or in the temple, is there anything of an image for God, because He has none. And the Jews were constrained by that. They were very careful to never, ever try to create any kind of icon that said this is what God is. And we reflect God's image, but how do we reflect it if God is imageless? Well, it seems to me God has given us an intellect. He gives us the capacity to do what in philosophy is called hold the position of causal agency. That is, we make choices, and those choices are real ones. They're not just internal things. They have consequences in this world. We looked at that in Sunday school, that we make choices about what we think, how we think, and those choices have consequences. We have a conscious process where we look at a choice, we weigh out the variables of that choice, we try to make that choice with some view in mind of predicted outcomes, which I would say most of the time we want those predicted outcomes to be good ones. There is a revelation of God in this process, and I'd like for us to take a look at that today. So let's look at Joshua chapter 1. I'll begin reading in verse 1. After Moses, the Lord's servant, died, the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, "Moses, my servant, is dead. So get ready, cross the Jordan River, lead these people into the land I am ready to hand over to them. I'm handing over to you every place you set your foot, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the wilderness in the south to Lebanon in the north. It will extend all the way to the great river Euphrates in the east, including all of Syria, and all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the west," which, by the way, as we look at these borders, that's not what Israel possesses today. There's only been one time in history when they even came close to this. "No one will be able to resist you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I'll be with you. I will not abandon you, nor will I leave you alone. Be strong, be brave. You must lead these people in the conquest of the land that I solemnly promised their ancestors I would hand over to them. Make sure you're strong and brave. Carefully obey all the law my servant Moses charged you with, and all that is written in it. Do not swerve from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be successful in all that you do. This law scroll must not leave your lips. You must memorize it day and night, so that you can carefully obey everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and you will be successful. I repeat, be strong and brave. Don't be afraid and don't panic, for I, the Lord your God, am with you in all that you do." So Joshua instructed the leaders of the people, "Go through the camp and command the people. Prepare your supplies. Within 3 days you will cross the Jordan River and begin the conquest of the land the Lord your God is ready to hand over to you." Now, after this, you have a list of all the tribes. And then you come to verse 16. The people told Joshua, "We will do everything you say. We will go wherever you send us, just as we obeyed Moses," which is a clue. "So we will obey you. But may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against what you say and does not obey all your commands will be executed. But be strong and be brave." So what do we learn from this little text? Well, it seems to me several things. One is we learn that God loves us. He has things that he wants to see carried out in our lives, and that our obedience with Him or toward Him is not for His good but for our own. That seems pretty reasonable to me. God doesn't ask us to obey to make Himself happy. He asks us to obey because it's for our own good. So how do we decide how to obey? Well, we've got a Bible, and we've also got prayer. We can commune with God, and we can make choices about the things we're going to pray to God for, right? I think we do. But then God has choices to make too. God can choose how He's going to answer those prayers. And in each choice we make, just as we kind of examined in the Sunday school class today, God's entrance into our lives is either accommodated such that He changes us in the way He would want to see us changed, or it's resisted. We make a choice. And God has given us this incredible power to turn right straight to Him and say, no, I will not. Now, and we're either going to grow toward Him or we're going to grow away from Him. In every choice we make. I mean, it's hard to conceptualize how fine-grained that idea is, but every choice we are making in some way is going to draw us toward God or away. There are no neutral choices in this universe that we can make. We have causal agency, and everything we choose has a consequence of some kind. Now, Israel gives this beautiful, zealous response. We will do it. There's a clue there, because they expand on that and say, just as we obeyed Moses. Well, how did they obey Moses? Not very well. Not very well. So what's going on here? God grants them, just as He grants us, the capacity to move through this life and make these choices. And this is one of those where I think they have a sincere desire here. I believe them when they say, we will do it. We will obey you just like we did Moses. But we've got this glorified hindsight of this Bible where we can look at not this history, but all the history going forward from this point. And we can see that they didn't do it, right? But I think they really believed they would. It's a very short-sighted. This reminds me so much of myself here. How easy is, and I do this all the time, how easy is it to say yes to something with full intention to carry it out? Ask my wife. Rip, will you change the dog's water bowl? Yes, I will do it. Just like Israel. Hour later, she comes outside. The water's still got leaves floating in it because I haven't changed anything. So easy to say those things, isn't it? To say, oh yes, I'll do that. And then to just not carry it out. In saying it, there's a sincerity there, but the sincerity is one that I think we don't reckon with, and that is, it's going to feel good for me to say yes. I'm going to feel good about myself. I'm going to make that person feel good. From the standpoint of Israel, they probably said we'll make Joshua feel good by saying yes. Make God feel good by saying yes. Why are they here to begin with? Well, they were here 40 years ago. Same place, same situation. Let's cross the Jordan River. Same choices. Go back to Numbers and read about all of those events wherein they would not take the land and they wound up walking around in the desert for 40 years. They were afraid to take the land. And you know what? Again, I look back at this moment and I say, that was a rational fear. It wasn't crazy to be afraid to go into the promised land. They sent the spies. 2 of the spies came back and said, let's go. God's given it to us. But the rest of the other 10 said, we're not going in there. They're like giants. We're like grasshoppers. They've got big forts and big cities. We can't go in there and take them. We're not an army. And look, in rational terms, I'm with them. I'd be the same way. Imagine yourself at this age, where you are right now, where we are. How many of you are ready to pick up a weapon and go into battle? Especially in the Bronze Age, where it's going to be a sword. You're going to hack at other people while they hack at you. Are you ready for that? I'm not. So it'd be scary to be faced with, what does it say? Take the land. It doesn't say just go in there and it's yours. Got to go take it. God's going to give it to you, and that sounds really good. But how many things do we know biblically that God says he will do that we're afraid to do? Because we're afraid, what? God's not going to come through and I'm going to get hurt. Lots of things like that. And then there's another feature of this. And by the way, before we think that God was too harsh with them, you have to remember, these people watched God spread an ocean out and turn it into 2 walls of water and the land across the middle of it be dry so that they could cross. They're responsible for that remembering. They know that happened. And so in being responsible for that, it reminds me of what Jesus says to you and to me. Blessed are they who have not seen and yet believe. There's a sense in which, it's better that we don't see too much sometimes, because we'll be responsible for what we've seen. There's another piece here. This is something about which I am eternally guilty, and that is a romantic view of the past. I look back at life. What do we say about the past? The good old days when things were better. What do we say in our own lives as we look back? We look at some feature of where we were in life, and we look at that romantically. We remember none of the difficulties. We only remember the good features. I do that all the time. Oh, if I could just be 24, I would choose radically differently than I did when I was 24. No, I wouldn't. I'd do the same thing. It's because I have knowledge of the past that I'm able to say that to myself, but it's a lie. That's a romantic look at features of our lives, and the Jews did the same thing. What did they say when they left Egypt? Right after they crossed the sea with the walls of water. Man, you remember how it was in Egypt? Our pots were full. We had plenty to eat and drink. We had shelter. We could raise our children in safety. Never mind the fact that we were slaves and we wanted to be out of there. We've forgotten that part, but we like all the other parts. Oh, we're so like that. I have such sympathy for the Jews at this point because I know that I'm exactly like this. So many times God places something in front of us and says, go this way, and we're just not ready. We're not ready. And so we hold to that romantic view of the past, and God says, if that's the way you want it, just keep on going. I'll come back later. God says to us, why don't you just wander around for a while until you learn what it is I'm trying to teach you? That's exactly what he did with the Jews. The most powerful word in the universe, in my view, is choice. We have the power to say no to the maker of the universe. Can you think of anything more powerful than that? Gosh, God has given us something that is just astonishing. And the choices have brought Israel a second time to this spot, but in a different condition. Because God has brought consequences for the first choice. What's the consequence? Well, that most of those who chose poorly the first time have died. They've just died off. And those who didn't die off have had their thinking changed by a 40-year wandering in the desert. Now, when we violate God and his will for our lives, and sometimes unknowingly we do, right? It's not that we're just maliciously saying, oh, no, God, I'm not going to do that. We're not thinking like that. But there are things that we want, things that we think are important. And I'm totally guilty of this. And so I'll place those in front of what God is asking of me in a moment. And I'll choose what I want as opposed to what God wants. Well, when God brings consequences to us, that looks harsh. But I want to stop and think about this for just a minute in this consequence. This 40-year wandering, it looks so harsh to me. But I think it looks harsh because I'm not thinking about it in terms of God's perspective. God's perspective is this is completely merciful. Totally merciful. Think about it. There was one point in which they defied God on Mount Sinai while Moses was up there getting the documents together. And when he came down, God was so mad because they said, you know, we've forgotten this guy Moses. What happened to him? Well, we hadn't seen him for a month, and we couldn't wait any longer, so we just threw this gold in the fire, and a calf came out, and we started bowing down to it and worshiping it. And God was so angry, he says to Moses, you know what? Let's just kill them all and start over with you. That was God's response. And then Moses says, no, don't do that, because if you do that, then the rest of the world's going to condemn you for the way you treated us. You brought us out here in the desert to kill us? Come on. And God says, okay, Moses, you're making a logical argument. I'll not do that. I'll be merciful to them. And he was. This 40-year trip is merciful. How do I know that? Well, God brings us to places of change all the time. And I am the worst person to ask about change because I don't like it at all. Don't talk to me about changing your life, Rip, because Rip does not like change. I like boring. I like it to be boring. I want to get up tomorrow and do much the same thing I did yesterday and the day after, and I want to spend my day doing the things that I kind of am used to. And I don't want any of that to go away. I don't want some big insertion into my life from God to change my life. I want to just keep going like I am. Oh, Lord, you're so good. I love you. And don't make my life any different than it really is. I'm like that. I mean, sometimes we get born again, and then we go through 40 years of just stagnation. Thank you, Lord. I'm in church every Sunday, but nothing in my life is going to be different. We don't think like that. We think it's going to be the same. And sometimes this nation, just as we, comes to this spot where God is saying, I want you to do this. And they say, we're not going to do it. We're afraid to do it. Well, that looks just like us to me. I'm afraid of all kinds of things. I'm afraid of my socioeconomic circumstances being changed radically because God would say to me, Rip, I want you to do this. And then God has to face us with some kind of pain in order to help us decide better. Now, think about it this way. Have you ever thought about this with God in terms of his options at this point with the Jews? What are his options? I think there are only three. Now, you may be able to think of 4 or 5. I can only think of 3. The first one is he can make them go, right? He can just force them to go across the Jordan and take the land and just whip them the whole way across. He could do that. God's omnipotent. He could make you and me do anything. But he doesn't. Another thing he could do is just what he started to do when they cast the golden calf. He could just abandon them. The heck with you. I'm washing my hands of this people. I'll go find another. He could do that. The third thing he can do is make them ready to go. I think about it in terms of child rearing. What if any of us with children, they came to us, they rebelled, they wouldn't do what we're asking. They're 7 years old. And 7-year-olds can be pretty rebellious. And we just say, okay, that's it for you. Here, let me help you pack your clothes. You're out of here. I'm just letting you go. I'm not going to take care of you anymore, you ungrateful wretch. I was called that as a child once, an ungrateful wretch. And justifiably, really, from my parents' perspective, they're feeding me, clothing me, taking me to the doctor, doing everything for me, and I'm complaining about it in some way that makes them utterly miserable. Well, they just got tired of it and said, or at least they wanted me to think that. Well, God, that's a choice for God, but is that a choice that a good parent would make? No. So I want to ask us the question as we think about this. Have there been places where we've made poor choices? And in making those poor choices, we limited God in what he could really do with us in some way. What he might have done with us. And in those poor choices, did we then experience a long period of being remolded by God? Absolutely. I'd say Rip knows places like that in his own life, where I just defied God, and he said, okay, that's the way you want it, and now I'm going to remold you. And the remolding wasn't done because God was mad, like a parent would be mad. They were done for different reasons. You see, those fleeting moments that we all live, we're not thinking about them in terms of what God would do in us in those fleeting moments. We're just living them, right? They're coming and going. We're not thinking about them very deeply. We just experience life in certain ways. But you know, God knows what's best for you. He knows what's best for me. He knows what's best for the whole world. He knows who He intends us to be. The whole history of Israel, what is it? G.K. Chesterton says the history of Israel is this: a parent pursuing wayward children. I think he's exactly right. God has to let us choose and then walk through the consequences. And sometimes those consequences, God responds to them in a way that says, I'm going to let you wander around for some time until you learn the lesson I'm trying to bring. I mean, that's where we have this picture in our, I do, maybe I'm the only one, but we have a picture of what successful living looks like. And in that picture of success, sometimes God's just got to violate the picture. Not because He is mad or doesn't love us, but just the opposite. We can't see God's best most of the time. I can't. And His violation looks to me like some kind of debilitation for me. Gosh, God. And I'm not, I'm so dense that I don't even think like that. I just think, gosh, I wish this weren't happening to me. I'm not even thinking about maybe God's got something I need to see here. I mean, we all view success as like wealth enough to be comfortable, peace, good reputation, shalom. That's how we look at success. That's how the biblical Jews looked at success, shalom. So how do we figure this out? I mean, how do we get to the place where we see what success is from God's perspective? I think part of our perspective and part of our problem with perspective is we don't really picture success like God does. Let me read something for you here. It's an incidental verse in the Acts that you and I, if I hadn't been thinking like this, I would have never noticed it. Paul is speaking to a bunch of people there, and he says this in a kind of a sermon that he gives. He says, for David, King David, after he had served all of God's purposes in his own generation, died and was buried with his ancestors. Gosh, it seems to me that that's not my perspective on my life. I don't look at life like that. But you know, if I lock myself into goals and they're not God's goals, then I'm going to look at those things as failures where I didn't achieve that which I thought was what I should have achieved. And look, let's face it, you got birth to death. That's it. All of life is right there contained. Maybe I'm not going to get where I think I ought to be. But does that mean that in that time span it's a failure on my part? I don't think so. You know, God can serve in your life and my life His purposes over that period of birth to death. And then when He's done with us, just like David was dead and buried with his ancestors. You know, the only thing that I bet you David, I could be wrong, but it seems that way to me, that David probably had lots of things in his life that he wanted to do for God. Lots of them. But because of choices he had made, some of those things were limited to him where he could not be those things. Paul says this, and look, it's the constancy of choosing on God's behalf that is success. That is success, biblically. That is the only success there is. The finishing is in the choosing, not necessarily in what we accomplish. Teresa said it well. God didn't ask me to be successful. He just asked me to be faithful. Paul says this, therefore, if you've been raised in Christ, keep seeking the things above. where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Keep thinking about things above, not things on the earth. For you've died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you too will be revealed in glory with him. There was a gardener. This is just a funny story, but I think it captures this in some ways. There was a gardener. This guy had a lawn that was just perfect. I mean, every grass blade was beautiful and green and manicured. Every flower bed was bordered. There were no weeds anywhere in this yard, no weeds in the flower beds. Everything just looked like something out of a magazine. Well, one year he wakes up in springtime and he looks out there and he sees a few dandelions in the grass. He thinks, what's going on here? So he does whatever he can to get rid of them. Next year there are more. What's going on? You know, I'm working so hard for this perfect lawn. I want to be successful. And then the next year there are even more. So finally he writes the county extension agent and says, look, I got these dandelions. What should I do? The county extension agent sends him a whole list of things, chemicals, different things to try. He tries all of them, and 2 years later the dandelions are everywhere. So he writes the county extension agent a letter and says, what's going on? I tried everything you said and then some, and I got more dandelions today than I had then. So the county extension agent sends him a letter back, and it's just a little short sentence that says, try getting used to them. That's the end of the story for him. You know, contentment is not having, and I love this, I wish I'd made it up. Contentment is not having everything we want in life. Contentment's being happy with what we have. And God is giving you and me an opportunity every minute of every day to be just what he calls us to be in that moment. And we get the power to choose to say yes or no. And those choices have consequences in terms of whether we grow closer to him or further from him. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything